In the summer of 2017, Phoenix hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and airlines canceled more than 40 flights. The tarmac wasn't melting. The engines worked fine. The planes sat intact at their gates while passengers were told it was simply too hot to fly. You've probably seen a version of this story, or lived it, sitting at the gate, sweating, watching a perfectly functional airplane go nowhere. A jet engine operates internally at over 2,000 degrees. The airframe is built to fly over the Sahara, through Gulf humidity, in and out of Dubai in August. A machine that handles lightning strikes, bird impacts, and the sub-zero temperatures of 40,000 feet, grounded by a number on a thermometer. But those flights didn't move, not because the heat was damaging the aircraft, but because it was breaking the math. The intuitive explanation goes something like this. Extreme heat makes the air thin, and thin air means the wings can't generate enough lift. The plane physically cannot get off the ground. There's a kernel of truth in that. Hot air is genuinely less dense. The molecules spread further apart as temperature rises, so a given volume of atmosphere contains fewer of them. Less air flowing over the wings means less lift at any given speed. That part is correct. But the wings don't stop working in hot air. They work fine. They just need the airplane to go faster before they can support its weight. In thinner air, the plane has to roll longer and accelerate harder to generate the same lift force. Major airports have runways 10,000 to 12,000 feet long, more than enough pavement for a significantly longer takeoff roll. So, if the wings still work and the runway is long enough, why is the plane sitting at the gate? The answer starts with something most passengers never think about: the difference between the speed the airplane believes it's traveling and the speed it's actually traveling. The airspeed indicator in the cockpit doesn't measure ground speed. It measures how many air molecules are physically striking a small tube on the nose of the aircraft every second. That reading, called indicated airspeed, is what the wings care about. It tells them how much lift they're producing. In hot, thin air, those molecules are spaced further apart. To push the same number of them into that tube per second, to register the same indicated airspeed, the airplane has to move much faster across the concrete. On a standard day, a narrow-body jet lifts off at around 150 knots indicated, which roughly matches its speed over the ground. On a 120-degree day in Phoenix, the cockpit still reads 150 knots at rotation. A radar gun on the side of the runway would clock the airplane well over 180 miles per hour, and heavier jets with higher rotation speeds can push past 200. The instruments tell the crew what the wings feel. They don't reveal how fast the tires are spinning or how much energy the brakes would have to absorb if something goes wrong. But the aerodynamics are only half the problem. The engine side is worse, and the reason runs directly against what anyone would expect. When air gets thin and the airplane desperately needs more thrust, you'd expect the engines to respond by working harder. Full throttle, full power. That's how every engine most people have ever used works: a car, a lawnmower, a boat. Jet engines don't do that. Every modern turbofan is governed by a computer called the FADEC, the Full Authority Digital Engine Control, and it has final authority over how much fuel the engine burns. The engine is designed to deliver a guaranteed constant maximum thrust up to a specific ambient temperature, typically around 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that, the engine is physically capable of producing far more power than its rated output, but the FADEC holds it back to preserve the internal components. Above that temperature, something shifts. The air entering the compressor is already hot. Burning fuel in already hot air drives the exhaust gas temperature toward the metallurgical limits of the turbine blades, components spinning at 15,000 revolutions per minute in gases exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius, which is hotter than the melting point of the alloy they're cast from. They survive only because of ceramic thermal barriers and microscopic cooling channels drilled by laser. So the FADEC does what it's programmed to do. It cuts fuel flow. It sacrifices thrust to keep the blades intact. For every degree Celsius above the flat rate temperature, the engine loses roughly 1% of its rated thrust. On a 120-degree day, that can mean 15 to 20% less power than the engine's maximum. The engine is protecting itself at the exact moment the airplane needs everything it has. Now add what's happening on the ground. At those elevated ground speeds, the tires are approaching their structural speed limit, around 235 miles per hour for most commercial transport aircraft. If ground speed climbs any higher, centrifugal force begins to stretch and separate the rubber from within. On the hottest days, the margin between liftoff speed and tire failure can shrink to single digits. But the tires aren't the hardest limit. The brakes are. If the pilot has to abort the takeoff at those speeds, the carbon brake stacks must absorb the aircraft's entire kinetic energy and convert it into heat. Kinetic energy scales with the square of velocity. At hot day ground speeds, a rejected takeoff dumps over 50 megajoules into the brakes. That's roughly the energy of a loaded semi-truck crashing into a concrete wall at 110 miles per hour, concentrated into carbon rotors that glow past 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. If that energy exceeds what the brakes can absorb, the heat soaks through the wheel hub and into the tire. The nitrogen inside expands toward detonation pressure. Every aircraft wheel contains a small metal plug cast from a low melting point alloy, a fusible plug, engineered to melt at precisely 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The wheel is designed to destroy itself, so nothing worse happens. Even with all of that, the reduced thrust, the higher speeds, the stressed brakes, two running engines can still get the airplane airborne on a 120-degree day. The machine works. Those 40 flights didn't stay at the gate because the plane couldn't fly. If you want these showing up in your feed, subscribing takes 1 second. They stayed because of a calculation that has to check out before the parking brake comes off. And on that afternoon, for those airplanes, it didn't. The reason airlines bump passengers, offload cargo, and leave luggage behind on the hottest days traces to a single federal regulation most travelers have never heard of. Under FAR 25.121, a twin-engine airplane must be able to lose its most critical engine at the worst possible moment during the takeoff roll, and still climb away on the remaining engine at a gradient of at least 2.4%. That translates to gaining 2.4 feet of altitude for every 100 feet of forward travel. Barely a visible incline, but legally absolute. On a normal day, clearing that gradient is routine. On a 120-degree day, the one remaining engine is already being choked by the FADEC. The thin air barely supports the thrust it can produce, and the airplane is fully loaded. The 2.4% becomes unreachable. The plane isn't grounded because two engines can't handle the heat. It's grounded because one engine can't. When the dispatch computers return that answer, the airline has exactly one lever to pull: weight. They can't increase thrust. Physics and the FADEC have capped it. So they pull passengers off the flight, remove cargo, leave baggage at the gate. Every pound shed nudges the thrust-to-weight ratio closer to the legal minimum. If they can't shed enough, the flight is canceled outright. And here's the detail that makes the 2017 grounding click into place. Almost every canceled flight was a regional jet, a Bombardier CRJ. The CRJ's flight manual contained certified performance data up to 118 degrees Fahrenheit. At 120 degrees, the chart stopped. Without approved takeoff speeds, verified climb gradients, or calculated brake energy limits, dispatching the aircraft wasn't merely risky, it was a violation of federal law. The CRJ could probably handle 119 degrees just fine, but probably doesn't exist in commercial aviation dispatch. If the performance wasn't flight tested, it wasn't certified. If it wasn't certified, the page doesn't exist in the manual. If the page doesn't exist, the airplane doesn't move. Boeing 737s and Airbus A320s flew from the same gates, in the same heat, because their manufacturers had tested and certified data up to 126 or 127 degrees. The air was identically thin. The physics were identical. The difference was a page of approved math, and a manufacturer willing to pay for it. Producing that math requires brutal testing. To certify the maximum brake energy limit, the manufacturer loads a test aircraft to its absolute maximum weight and accelerates to decision speed. The pilot commands a full stop, using brake pads worn to minimum thickness, with thrust reversers disabled. The aircraft must come to a halt and then sit on the runway for 5 full minutes without firefighting intervention. During those 5 minutes, the brakes routinely catch fire. The fusible plugs melt. The tires deflate with a roar. If the fire hasn't spread to the fuselage before the clock runs out, the design passes. The heat problem compounds with altitude. Denver International sits at 5,400 feet above sea level. On a 90-degree day in Colorado, the air is thinner than it would be in Miami at 110 degrees. That's why Denver built a 16,000-foot runway, more than 3 miles of continuous concrete, giving heavily loaded jets enough room to reach elevated ground speeds and still have pavement to stop on. The runway solves the brake energy problem on the ground. The one-engine climb gradient in the air is a separate calculation no amount of concrete can fix, and the margins are shrinking. Climate research projects that by mid-century, up to 30% of flights departing during peak afternoon heat will require weight restrictions. On a standard 160-seat airplane, that translates to removing up to 13 passengers on the hottest days, not because the plane can't fly, but because the math can't guarantee it survives losing an engine during the climb. Next time you're sitting on a scorching tarmac and the air conditioning abruptly cuts out right before takeoff, the airline isn't saving money. The pilots just close the bleed valves so the engine can keep every molecule of compressed air for thrust. The cabin heats up because the FADEC won't let the engine spare anything. The heat doesn't break the airplane. It narrows every margin, aerodynamic, thermodynamic, mechanical, and legal, until one of them closes entirely. What's something you've noticed on a hot weather flight that you've never understood? Drop it in the comments.